Coming on the air with major developments involving Donald Trump. This involves New York State's civil fraud trial against Donald Trump and a massive blow to Trump and his sons, Don Jr. and Eric Trump. Judge Arthur Engoron has just released his ruling on damages against both the former president and his sons for the exaggeration of the values of their real estate holdings in order to receive benefits for loans and insurance purposes, according to New York's attorney.
Okay, so the White House is in absolute chaos right now. And what we're witnessing is something that has never happened in American history. We're talking about a sitting president of the United States having his personal assets actively seized by court order while he's still in office. And this isn't some minor procedural thing that legal teams can sweep under the rug. This is a federal judge absolutely destroying every single legal argument the Trump administration has thrown at the court, systematically dismantling the president's claims one by one. And now enforcement officers are literally beginning the process of taking control of Trump properties. We're watching constitutional crisis territory unfold in real time, and the implications of this go far beyond just Trump himself. This affects the presidency as an institution, the balance of power between the executive branch and the judiciary, America's credibility on the world stage, and the entire political landscape heading into the later part of 2026. This is massive. This is unprecedented, and this is happening right now as we speak. Now, before we dive deep into what's actually happening here and why this matters so much, we need to talk about something important. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They're either going to bury this story, spin it to protect their preferred narrative, or give you surface-level coverage that completely misses the constitutional earthquake that's actually taking place. That's exactly why we built US Power Alert, to bring you real stories, real context, and absolutely no corporate spin whatsoever. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's really happening in American politics before everyone else figures it out, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day, breaking down the power dynamics, the institutional fights, and the real consequences that affect your life. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth and holding power accountable, this is your moment. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's make sure the truth gets out there together. Here's what happened. A federal judge overseeing one of the major civil cases against Donald Trump just issued a ruling that essentially obliterates every legal defense the president's attorneys have been using to try to stop the enforcement of previous judgments against him. We're talking about cases related to fraud, business practices, and financial obligations that have been working their way through the courts for years, some of which resulted in massive judgments against Trump personally, not against the government, not against some corporate entity, but against Donald J. Trump as an individual. And those judgments have real numbers attached to them. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in some instances. Now, Trump's legal team has been fighting tooth and nail to delay enforcement, to appeal every possible angle, to claim presidential immunity, to argue that seizing assets while he's serving as president creates constitutional problems. They've thrown everything at the wall trying to make something stick. And this judge just went through every single one of those arguments methodically, and in what legal observers are calling an absolutely brutal opinion, rejected them all. The opinion itself reads like a constitutional law textbook mixed with a prosecutor's closing argument. The judge makes it crystal clear that being president of the United States does not grant you immunity from civil judgments that were entered before you took office, that it doesn't give you the power to simply refuse to pay what you legally owe, and that the enforcement of those judgments doesn't interfere with the president's ability to perform his duties. The judge even goes further, pointing out that Trump's arguments essentially ask the court to create a new form of presidential privilege that doesn't exist anywhere in American law, doesn't exist in the Constitution, and would effectively place the president above the law in ways that the founders explicitly rejected when they designed our system of government. And then comes the enforcement order. The judge authorizes the immediate beginning of asset seizure procedures. That means court-appointed officers, working with relevant authorities, are now empowered to identify Trump properties, businesses, accounts, and other assets, and begin the legal process of taking control of them to satisfy the outstanding judgments. Now let's be clear about what this actually means in practice, because this isn't theoretical anymore. We're talking about enforcement officers showing up at Trump properties, potentially taking control of real estate holdings, freezing bank accounts tied to Trump personally, putting liens on buildings with the Trump name on them, and beginning the process of liquidating assets if necessary to pay off these judgments. And all of this is happening while Donald Trump is sitting in the Oval Office as the 47th President of the United States. The White House response has been predictably explosive. Trump himself has been raging on social media, calling this a witch hunt, calling it election interference even though we're in 2026, and this has nothing to do with any current election, claiming this is a political hit job by a corrupt judiciary. His press secretary held an emergency briefing where she essentially repeated those talking points, said the administration is exploring every possible legal avenue to stop this, and hinted that they might take unprecedented steps to protect presidential assets. Legal experts who heard that language immediately started raising alarm bells, because what exactly does that mean? Is the administration suggesting they might use executive power to somehow interfere with court enforcement? Is the president going to try to invoke some emergency authority? The lack of clarity is itself creating massive uncertainty. Meanwhile, inside the Republican Party, there's a full-blown meltdown happening behind closed doors. You've got moderate Republicans who are absolutely terrified of how this looks, who understand that having a sitting president's assets seized is historically unprecedented and makes America look unstable to the rest of the world. They're quietly reaching out to legal scholars, asking if there's any constitutional way to handle this that doesn't make things worse. Then you've got the MAGA wing that's in full defense mode, already drafting legislation to try to create some kind of presidential asset protection law, floating ideas about impeaching judges, talking about this as proof that the deep state is trying to destroy Trump. And you've got party leadership stuck in the middle, trying to figure out how to navigate this without either looking weak on supporting their president or looking like they're endorsing placing the president above the law. The chaos inside the GOP right now is very real, very deep, and it's only going to get worse as this enforcement process actually begins. Democrats, meanwhile, are being extremely careful about how they handle this publicly. They're letting the judicial process speak for itself, making statements about respecting the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. But you can see they're watching very closely to see if Trump tries to use presidential power to interfere with court enforcement. If that happens, you're going to see immediate calls for congressional oversight, potential articles of impeachment depending on what form that interference takes, and a massive political battle over whether the president can use the executive branch to protect himself from civil judgments. Behind the scenes, Democratic legal teams are already gaming out scenarios, preparing for every possible move the White House might make, and coordinating with state attorneys general, who might have their own enforcement capabilities if federal processes get blocked somehow. Now let's talk about the legal framework here, because understanding why this judge rejected Trump's arguments requires understanding some fundamental principles of American law and the presidency. The Constitution is very clear that the president is not above the law. The founders explicitly rejected the idea of creating an American king, someone who would be immune from legal accountability. Yes, there are certain protections for the president while in office. You can't criminally prosecute a sitting president for official acts taken as president. That's an unsettled but generally accepted principle based on Justice Department guidance and some Supreme Court reasoning. But that's about criminal prosecution for official actions. What we're dealing with here is civil enforcement of judgments for things Trump did as a private citizen, as a businessman, before he became president. These aren't actions he took as president. These aren't exercises of executive power. These are personal business dealings that courts have found to be fraudulent or otherwise legally problematic. And there's absolutely no legal principle that says becoming president wipes away your personal legal obligations from before you took office. The judge makes this distinction very clearly in the opinion. The ruling walks through the history of presidential immunity, explains exactly what it covers and what it doesn't cover, and makes it abundantly clear that civil judgments for private conduct are not protected by any form of presidential immunity. The judge cites previous cases, cites constitutional history, cites statements from the founding era, all pointing to the same conclusion. The president is a citizen who happens to hold high office, and like every other citizen, is bound by court judgments. Trump's lawyers tried to argue that seizing presidential assets while he's in office interferes with his ability to do his job, creates national security concerns, undermines the dignity of the presidency. The judge systematically dismantles each of these arguments. How exactly does enforcing a civil judgment interfere with presidential duties? The president doesn't use his personal real estate holdings to conduct foreign policy. The president doesn't need his personal bank accounts to command the military. The assets in question are private property used for private business purposes, and seizing them has no bearing whatsoever on the constitutional functions of the presidency. And here's where things get really important from an institutional standpoint. If the court were to accept Trump's arguments, if the judge were to say that being president means you can't be subject to civil enforcement for judgments against you personally, you would be creating a completely new category of presidential power that doesn't exist anywhere in our constitutional system. You would essentially be saying that anyone who becomes president gets a free pass on all their personal legal obligations for the duration of their presidency. Think about what that would mean going forward. Any wealthy individual with massive civil judgments against them could run for president, and if they win, use the presidency as a shield against enforcement. Any president could engage in fraudulent business practices, knowing that as long as they hold office, they're untouchable. The entire concept of equal justice under law would be undermined. The judge recognizes this and makes it a central part of the reasoning. Allowing this would not just protect Trump, it would fundamentally alter the relationship between the presidency and the law in ways that would damage American democracy for generations. Trump's legal team also tried to argue that the judgments themselves were politically motivated, that the cases against him were driven by political enemies trying to destroy him, and that enforcing these judgments while he's president is election interference. The judge addresses this head-on and basically says, these are final judgments entered by courts after full legal processes, with opportunities for appeal that have been exhausted or are still pending in proper appellate channels. The question before this court is not whether the underlying judgments were correct. That's for appeals courts to decide. The question is whether final judgments can be enforced, and the answer is yes. If Trump believes the judgments were wrong, he can continue his appeals, but being president doesn't freeze all enforcement in the meantime. The normal legal process applies to him just like it would apply to anyone else. And as for the election interference claim, the judge points out that we're in 2026. There's no election immediately pending that this affects, and more fundamentally, courts enforcing lawful judgments cannot be characterized as election interference just because the person subject to the judgment happens to hold office. Now let's break down what this actually means, because the implications here are absolutely enormous, and they touch every aspect of American politics, international relations, and the institutional structure of our government. First, understand that this is the first time in American history that a sitting president is having personal assets actively seized by court order. We've never been in this territory before. Presidents have faced civil lawsuits while in office. Clinton famously had the Paula Jones case that went to the Supreme Court. But that was about whether the lawsuit could proceed, not about enforcing a final judgment and seizing assets. This is completely unprecedented, and when you're in unprecedented territory, there are no clear rules for how things are supposed to work. That creates massive uncertainty, and uncertainty in the presidency creates instability in American politics and in how the world views American leadership. Second, this raises enormous questions about presidential power and its limits. Trump has spent his entire presidency pushing the boundaries of executive authority, claiming expansive powers, using executive orders aggressively, threatening to use emergency authorities in ways that previous presidents never did. And now you have the judiciary stepping in on a completely different matter, a civil enforcement issue, and saying, no, there are limits. Being president doesn't make you immune from the law. This is the separation of powers in action. This is the courts serving as a check on the presidency. But here's the problem. If Trump decides to resist this enforcement, if the White House tries to use executive power to interfere with court officers, you're looking at a constitutional crisis that could escalate very quickly. The judiciary has no army. It has no enforcement mechanism beyond relying on executive branch cooperation and the respect for the rule of law. If the president decides not to cooperate, things get very complicated very fast. Third, think about the political implications heading deeper into 2026 and looking toward future elections. Trump's entire political brand is built on being strong, being a winner, being someone who dominates his opponents. Having his assets seized, having court officers taking control of properties with his name on them, that's the opposite of that image. That's Trump being held accountable, Trump being forced to comply, Trump losing. His opponents are going to use this to argue that he's weak, that he's a fraud, that his business empire was built on illegal practices and is now crumbling. Democrats are going to hammer this message relentlessly. But here's where it gets complicated. Trump has a remarkable ability to turn legal troubles into political fuel with his base. He's already framing this as persecution, as the deep state trying to destroy him, as proof that the establishment is terrified of him. And for a significant portion of the Republican base, that message resonates. They see this as confirmation that Trump is the anti-establishment fighter they believe in. So while this damages Trump's image in some ways, it might actually strengthen his support among his core supporters. The question is whether it moves the middle, whether suburban voters, independents, moderate Republicans, start to see this as disqualifying. Fourth, let's talk about international implications, because this matters enormously to how the world views America right now. Foreign leaders are watching this and asking themselves, is the American president stable? Can we trust that our agreements with the United States will be honored when the president himself is in the middle of asset seizures and legal chaos? Our allies in Europe, in Asia, they rely on American leadership. They rely on stability in the White House. When that stability is called into question, it affects everything from NATO coordination to trade negotiations to security partnerships. Adversaries like Russia, like China, they're watching this and seeing it as evidence of American weakness, American internal chaos, American institutional breakdown. They're going to use this to push their own agendas more aggressively, to test American resolve, to sow doubt among American allies. The propaganda value of a U.S. president having assets seized while in office is enormous for authoritarian regimes that want to argue that democracy is messy and unstable. Fifth, think about the economic and market implications. Investors and markets hate uncertainty, and uncertainty about the stability of the American presidency creates massive volatility. If there's any indication that Trump might try to use executive power to interfere with court enforcement, if there's any escalation toward constitutional crisis, markets are going to react negatively. You could see sell-offs. You could see investors moving money out of American assets into safer havens. You could see credit rating agencies starting to question American institutional stability. And if this drags on, if it becomes a prolonged battle between the presidency and the judiciary, that uncertainty compounds. Business leaders need to know that contracts will be enforced, that the rule of law applies, that the system works. When the president himself is fighting court enforcement, it raises questions about the entire legal framework that business relies on. Sixth, let's talk about the actual enforcement process and what happens next. The judge's order authorizes asset seizure, but that's just the beginning of what could be a very long and very complicated process. Court-appointed officers now have to identify exactly what assets Trump owns personally, as opposed to assets owned by corporate entities, assets held in trust, assets tied up in complex business structures. Trump's businesses are notoriously opaque, with layers of LLCs and partnerships and arrangements that make it hard to figure out what he actually owns. The enforcement officers are going to have to work through all of that, potentially hiring forensic accountants, potentially subpoenaing financial records, potentially facing legal challenges at every step from Trump's lawyers, who are going to fight to protect every single asset. And here's the thing. Trump has decades of experience using the legal system to delay, to obstruct, to tie things up in litigation. He's going to use every trick in the book to slow this down. At the same time, there are going to be political questions about which assets to go after first. Do you start with high-profile properties like Trump Tower or Mar-a-Lago? Those are symbolically huge, but they're also likely tied up in complex ownership structures that make seizure difficult. Do you go after bank accounts and liquid assets first because they're easier to freeze and access? But then you risk claims that you're trying to bankrupt the president, which creates its own political firestorm. Do you focus on business interests that are clearly separate from presidential functions? The enforcement team has to navigate all of these considerations, while knowing that every move they make is going to be scrutinized, litigated, and politicized. And they're operating in completely unprecedented territory, because again, no one has ever tried to seize a sitting president's assets before. There's no playbook for this. Seventh, we need to consider the constitutional arguments that are definitely coming. Trump's lawyers are going to appeal this decision, obviously, and they're going to make every constitutional argument they can think of. They're going to argue that the Supremacy Clause protects the president from state enforcement actions, even though these are federal court judgments. They're going to argue that the separation of powers doctrine requires courts to defer to the presidency. They're going to argue that seizing presidential assets violates some unstated constitutional principle of executive independence. Some of these arguments are going to sound absurd to legal experts, But the goal isn't necessarily to win on the merits. The goal is to delay, to create enough legal complexity that enforcement gets tied up for months or years. And there's always the possibility that they find a sympathetic appellate judge, or that the case makes it to the Supreme Court, where the conservative majority might be willing to create new presidential protections that don't currently exist in the law. Eighth, think about the precedent this sets regardless of how it resolves. If the enforcement goes forward and Trump's assets are seized while he's president, you've established that the presidency doesn't protect you from civil judgment enforcement. That becomes a clear precedent for future presidents. It means that anyone running for president knows that their personal legal liabilities don't disappear if they win. That could actually be healthy for democracy. It could discourage people from viewing the presidency as a shield against accountability. But it also means that future presidents could be vulnerable to politically motivated civil suits designed to harass them or damage them financially. You could see a future where every president faces dozens of lawsuits from political opponents trying to bog them down in legal battles and asset fights. The implications cut both ways. On the other hand, if Trump successfully blocks this enforcement, if he uses presidential power to interfere, or if courts ultimately decide he's protected while in office, you've set a different precedent. You've established that becoming president does give you some form of immunity from civil enforcement, which future presidents will absolutely cite when they face similar situations. You've created a new presidential power that didn't exist before. And you've sent a message that the presidency really is above the law in certain respects, which is fundamentally at odds with democratic principles. So this case matters far beyond Trump personally. This is about defining the limits and nature of presidential power for decades to come. Ninth, let's talk about what's happening inside the Trump administration right now in response to this. According to people inside the White House, there are intense debates about how to respond. You've got legal advisors saying that Trump needs to comply, that fighting court enforcement makes things worse, that it gives his opponents ammunition to say he doesn't respect the rule of law. You've got political advisors saying that the base expects Trump to fight, that showing any weakness is deadly politically, that he needs to resist this with everything he's got. You've got national security officials worried about how this looks internationally and what it does to American credibility. And you've got Trump himself, who is reportedly furious, who sees this as a personal attack, who is demanding that his team find ways to stop it. That's creating chaos inside the White House, with different factions pulling in different directions, and no clear strategy emerging. There are reports that the administration is looking at extreme options. Could Trump try to claim that certain properties are essential to national security and therefore can't be seized? Could he try to transfer assets to family members or trusts to put them out of reach? Could he attempt to use executive power to block federal court officers from enforcing the judgment? All of these options create enormous legal and political risks. But when a president feels cornered, when his personal finances are on the line, rational decision-making sometimes goes out the window. Legal experts are watching very carefully to see if Trump crosses any red lines. Because if he does, you're talking about potential constitutional crises, potential impeachment scenarios, potential criminal obstruction charges after he leaves office. 10th, we need to consider the impact this has on Trump's ability to govern and maintain his agenda. Being president is about credibility, about authority, about the ability to get Congress to follow your lead, to get allies to trust you, to get opponents to fear you. When you're in the middle of asset seizures, when you're fighting desperate legal battles to protect your personal finances, that credibility takes a massive hit. Members of Congress start to wonder if you're focused on governing or focused on protecting yourself. Allies start to question whether you're making decisions based on national interest or personal interest. The entire presidency starts to look weaker, more chaotic, less effective. And that matters enormously for Trump's ability to pass legislation, to conduct foreign policy, to maintain party unity, to prepare for future elections. Republicans in Congress are already starting to distance themselves from Trump on various issues, and this is only going to accelerate that process. If Trump becomes too much of a liability, if supporting him looks like supporting someone who's above the law, moderate Republicans are going to start breaking away. You might see primary challenges against Trump-aligned members from Republicans who think the party needs to move on. You might see legislative defeats as Republicans refuse to back Trump's priorities. You might see a slow-motion collapse of Trump's political power even while he holds the office of president. And if that happens, His last 2 years in office could be marked by legislative gridlock, executive overreach as he tries to govern through executive orders because Congress won't cooperate, and increasing isolation both domestically and internationally. 11th, let's consider the public opinion dynamics and how this story is being received by different segments of the American public. For Trump supporters, especially the hardcore MAGA base, this is going to confirm every belief they have about the system being rigged against Trump. They see this as proof that the deep state, the corrupt judiciary, the political establishment are all working together to destroy the one person who threatens their power. This is going to make them more loyal to Trump, more convinced that he needs their support, more likely to turn out in future elections to defend him. The danger for Trump is that this energy doesn't necessarily translate into winning elections, because the MAGA base alone isn't enough to win in swing states and competitive districts. He needs to appeal to a broader coalition, and this kind of legal chaos makes that harder. For Democrats and Trump opponents, this is being seen as long overdue accountability. They've been waiting for years to see Trump face real consequences for what they view as a lifetime of fraud, corruption, and abuse. The fact that courts are actually enforcing judgments, that Trump can't simply lawyer his way out of everything, that being president doesn't shield him from accountability. This is satisfying to them on a deep level. But Democrats need to be careful about how they talk about this publicly, because if they look like they're celebrating or piling on, it could backfire and generate sympathy for Trump. The smarter play is to let the legal process speak for itself, to emphasize respect for the rule of law, and to avoid looking political about it. For independents and swing voters, this is where things get really interesting. These are the people who decide elections, the people who don't have strong partisan loyalty, who judge politicians on competence and character. How do they view a president having assets seized? Some of them are going to see this as disqualifying, as evidence that Trump is corrupt and shouldn't be in office. Some of them are going to see this as a distraction, as legal minutia that doesn't affect their daily lives. Some of them are going to wait and see how it plays out before forming an opinion. Polling over the next few months is going to be crucial in understanding whether this moves public opinion in any meaningful way. If Trump's approval ratings start dropping, especially in swing states, that's a sign that this is doing real political damage. If they hold steady, or even increase as Trump rallies his base, that's a sign that he's successfully framing this as persecution. 12th, we should talk about the media coverage of this and how different outlets are framing the story. Mainstream media outlets are covering this as a major legal development, focusing on the unprecedented nature of a sitting president facing asset seizure, analyzing the legal arguments, interviewing legal experts about the implications. Conservative media, especially outlets that are pro-Trump, are framing this as political persecution, as activist judges overstepping their authority, as another example of the system trying to take down Trump because they can't beat him politically. They're emphasizing Trump's claims of witch hunt and election interference. They're questioning the motives of the judges involved. They're suggesting that this is coordinated with Democrats and the deep state. Liberal media is emphasizing accountability, rule of law, Trump's history of fraud and corruption, the fact that these are final court judgments for actions Trump took as a private citizen. The divide in how this story is being covered is itself a reflection of how polarized America has become. How the same set of facts can be interpreted in completely opposite ways depending on your political perspective. And here's what matters about that media divide. People are increasingly living in separate information ecosystems. Trump supporters are getting their news from sources that tell them this is persecution. Trump opponents are getting their news from sources that tell them this is accountability. There's very little common ground, very little shared reality. That makes it almost impossible to have productive political debates, because people aren't even agreeing on basic facts. And it makes situations like this even more volatile, because each side is convinced that the other side is lying or deluded, and there's no trusted institution or media source that can bridge that gap. So the asset seizure story becomes not just about Trump and the law, but about the broader crisis of truth and shared reality in American democracy. 13th, let's think about the timeline here and what to watch for in the coming weeks and months. The immediate next steps are going to involve Trump's legal team filing emergency appeals trying to block enforcement while appeals are pending. They're going to argue that irreparable harm will occur if seizure proceeds, that Trump's rights are being violated, that the court should stay enforcement pending appellate review. Whether appellate courts grant those stays is going to be huge. If they do, it delays everything and gives Trump's team time to fight this in higher courts. If they don't, enforcement proceeds, and you could see actual seizures happening very quickly. Watch for any statements from the Justice Department about whether they're going to cooperate with enforcement or whether they're taking a position that complicates things. Watch for congressional reactions, especially from Republican leadership. If you start seeing Republicans in Congress criticizing the court, talking about legislation to protect presidential assets, holding hearings about judicial overreach, that tells you they're going to back Trump's resistance. If you see them staying quiet, offering only tepid support, emphasizing respect for the judicial process, that tells you they're trying to distance themselves. Watch for any moves by Trump to transfer assets or attempt to shield them from seizure. If news breaks that Trump is suddenly moving properties into different ownership structures or trying to liquidate certain holdings, that's a sign he's anticipating enforcement and trying to protect what he can. That kind of move could also create additional legal problems if courts view it as obstruction or an attempt to defeat enforcement. Watch for international reactions, especially from key allies. If you start seeing European leaders or Asian allies making public statements about respecting the rule of law, about the importance of judicial independence, even in subtle or diplomatic language, that's them trying to send a message that they're concerned about what this means for American stability. If you see adversaries like Russia or China amplifying this story, using it for propaganda purposes, highlighting American chaos and dysfunction, that tells you they're exploiting this for geopolitical advantage. Watch for any economic indicators, any signs that markets are reacting negatively to the uncertainty. If you see volatility in U.S. markets, if you see investors shifting to safer assets, if you see any credit rating warnings, that's a sign this is having real economic impact beyond just the political sphere. And watch for Trump's own behavior and statements. If he escalates his rhetoric, if he starts directly attacking judges by name, if he hints at using executive power to interfere with enforcement, those are warning signs that he might be preparing to cross constitutional red lines. If he moderates his tone, if his statements become more focused on legal arguments and less on personal attacks, that might suggest his advisors are convincing him to be more strategic. But based on Trump's history, betting on moderation is usually a losing bet. He tends to escalate, to fight harder when cornered, to view any compromise as weakness. So the most likely scenario is that this gets worse before it gets better. 14th, we need to consider the long-term institutional damage this could cause regardless of how it resolves. The presidency as an institution relies on a certain level of dignity, respect, and functional authority. When the person holding the office is in the middle of asset seizures, when they're fighting desperate legal battles, when their business empire is being dismantled by courts that damages the office itself, future presidents might find it harder to command respect, to exercise authority, to operate effectively, because the precedent has been set that the presidency can be this chaotic, this compromised, this legally embattled. The office has been diminished in some ways that are hard to quantify but very real. At the same time, if courts successfully enforce judgments against a sitting president, if they demonstrate that even the most powerful person in the country is subject to the rule of law, that could strengthen democratic institutions in the long run. It sends a message that no one is above the law, that checks and balances work, that the system can hold even presidents accountable. Which of these effects dominates, the damage to the presidency or the strengthening of judicial authority and rule of law, is going to depend on how this plays out and how the public interprets what happens. But either way, we're in historically significant territory. The decisions made in the next few months are going to shape American governance for decades. 15th, let's talk about the human element here, because it's easy to get lost in the constitutional analysis and political implications and forget that there are real people affected by this. Trump himself, whatever you think of him politically, is dealing with the prospect of losing assets he's spent a lifetime building, properties that bear his name, businesses that define his identity. That's got to be psychologically devastating on some level, and it's going to affect how he behaves as president. You're going to see someone who feels attacked, who feels that everything he's built is under threat, making decisions from that emotional place. That's dangerous when that person has nuclear codes, commands the military, and sets American foreign policy. There are also employees at Trump properties who might lose their jobs if assets are seized and businesses are disrupted. There are tenants in Trump buildings who might face uncertainty about their leases. There are business partners and contractors who have deals with Trump entities that might be affected. The ripple effects of asset seizure go beyond just Trump personally. They touch real people's livelihoods and lives. And then there are Trump's family members, who are also implicated in some of these business dealings, who might face their own legal exposure, who are watching their father or husband go through this while he's supposed to be leading the country. The family dynamics, the stress, the pressure, all of that feeds into the chaos. So here's the bottom line. We are watching an unprecedented constitutional moment unfold in real time. A sitting president of the United States is having personal assets seized by court order, and a federal judge has systematically destroyed every legal argument Trump's team has made to try to stop it. This isn't just about Trump's personal finances, although that's obviously important to him. This is about the limits of presidential power, the independence of the judiciary, the principle that no one is above the law, and the stability of American democratic institutions. The implications touch everything from domestic politics to international relations to economic confidence to the long-term health of the presidency as an institution. What happens next is going to shape American politics for years to come. If enforcement proceeds and Trump's assets are actually seized, we've crossed a line that's never been crossed before, and we're in completely uncharted territory. If Trump finds a way to block enforcement, whether through legal appeals or through some use of executive power, we've established a different kind of precedent about presidential immunity that raises its own set of problems. Either way, the constitutional crisis we're in doesn't have an easy resolution. This is going to be messy, it's going to be prolonged, it's going to be deeply divisive, and it's going to test American institutions in ways they haven't been tested in modern history. Keep your eyes on this story, because it's far from over. Watch for the appeals. Watch for any attempts at enforcement. Watch for how Congress reacts. Watch for how international allies respond. Watch for what Trump does next. This could define the rest of his presidency. It could reshape the balance of power between branches of government. It could determine the future of presidential accountability in America. We're living through a historical moment, and understanding what's actually happening, beyond the partisan spin and the surface-level coverage, is absolutely crucial. This is U.S. Power Alert, bringing you the real story behind the headlines, and we'll keep following this every step of the way. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is only beginning.